Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Barnard. I'm CEO of Goldwood Research Labs. It's a great privilege to present to you this basics workshop this afternoon. We will be talking about strategy and tactic, and probably one of the most powerful thinking process inventions that was made by Dr. Alan Barnard. In terms of the outline for the session, we'll follow the questions of change to try and justify to you the need for the change for strategy and tactic, how it works, showing you a little bit some of the examples. We'll look at different types of strategy and tactic trees, share with you some of the new applications, and end up with what I think could be simpler and faster ways of creating strategy and tactic trees. A few years ago, Dr. Alan Barnard famously said that there are only a handful of people that can write strategy and tactic trees. I said to him that, Eli, I respectfully disagree. I think that one day it will be like doing evaporating clouds, that yes, of course, there will always be differences in the quality, but there is no reason why anybody shouldn't be able to benefit from the logical structure. So let's see where it came from. In the early 1980s, Creative Output was one of the fastest growing companies in the USA. It was selling software, finite scheduling software, and it was doing very well, but Dr. Barnard was very concerned that at least the rate of change that he was seeing that was happening within his own organization made him sometimes feel as if the company that he created, that should be the more open for change, in fact was the most resistant to change. And this, of course, was highly frustrating for him, and also a real mystery. And he started asking himself, why? Why was this happening? His hypothesis was that mainly it was his own poor communication. And of course, it would have been easy to blame everybody else. It's much tougher to blame yourself because it means that you need to make some kind of change. And he started looking at the mechanism that he was using to communicate changes that he felt was absolutely necessary to achieve the desired outcomes for the clients, and started realizing that he was making some kind of mistakes quite frequently. Sometimes he was communicating the objective or the what for of a change, but neglecting to give any specific guidance on the how-to side. And this is quite problematic if there are many alternatives for how-to. So for example, if you imagine that the objective we want to achieve is to try to get to the top of the mountain, and you share that objective very clearly, very specifically with your team. You give them the dates that we want to achieve this by. You are as clear as possible that you can be on the objective. And to your surprise and horror, there's massive confusion in the company. Some people are going from the assumption that you are driving up the mountain to get to the top. Some people are going from the assumption that you are flying to the top, and other people are going from the assumption that you are climbing to the top. So as long as you realized there were alternatives ways of achieving a specific objective, it was vital that not only you gave the objective, but you also gave the how-to, the best way, or maybe the only way that you believe to get there. Of course, other times he was doing the exact opposite. He was immediately diving into the details, describing the specific changes in the process, for example, engaging with a client in terms of a sales process or distribution process, describing the specific changes in the how-to, without ever going back and checking, is the objective still the same? You can imagine what happens if you are making modifications in the process, but actually the objective of the process has changed. For example, rather than selling products, we are now trying to sell value. That's a complete difference in the actual objective that you're trying to achieve. And of course, when you're explaining changes in process without showing that the necessity for these changes are coming from the fact that we've actually changed the objective that we are trying to achieve, it can result in massive confusion and problems. The second mistake that he realized, it's not just switching between these two, giving the how-to without the what for, or the what for without the how-to. But when you present something as if it's a done deal, you prevent people from contributing. And of course, they can contribute in many ways. Some people are fantastic at contributing why things will never work, right? Some people are absolutely fantastic at contributing why things will work. What are the things, the additional things that maybe you didn't present, because we all have blind spots. And when you want people to really take ownership, you have to give them the opportunity to contribute. In fact, there's some fantastic research that has been done recently in behavioral economics. They call it the IKEA effect, which is that when we've contributed to a change, we perceive the value of that change much, much higher than if it was simply given to us. So we go to IKEA, we buy furniture, I have to bring it home, I have to partake in the assembly of this furniture, versus I'm going to a shop, another shop, and I'm simply buying the furniture. There's substantial differences in the perception of value when we give people the opportunity to contribute. And of course, the devastating part for himself was that this was another reminder that he hasn't yet applied the scientific method to this kind of problem. He's been aware of it for a long time, hoping to just push it through with charisma, sometimes a bit of force, and he realized that it was time to sit down and figure out how to solve this type of problem systematically, coming up with a new process. Any questions so far? Make sense so far? Everybody's on the page? You can see how we kind of all make those type of mistakes, whether it's communicating for peers, for our subordinates, for our top management, and even for our children. So a good scientific investigation always starts with classification, right? We agree on what we're going to call things. And sometimes it looks like this is relatively small chupchiks that we are busy with, but it's extremely important to define what we are talking about. Because if there are multiple definitions for words, and we're using these words as if there is only one definition, it can result in much confusion. So how do we go from classification, which is giving things definitions, essentially defining the what, to moving to correlation, which is starting to think about how these different parts relate to each other, and lastly, to cause and effect, and then turning that into applications. And in fact, these 4 steps in scientific investigation are the 4 steps that scientists can make major contributions. They can contribute new and useful classifications. They can contribute new and useful correlations. We call them laws, right? Because they define how things relate to each other. For example, E equal to mc squared is a governing law. It's a correlation. Cause and effect requires the answer to the question why, which are theories. Theories are the highest level of scientific investigation outcomes because they are better explanations, hopefully, than what we previously had about the why. And then the ultimate step is to turn that theory into practical applications. Some people give them away, others decide to patent them and make a lot of money. So let's see how we can apply this to the field of strategy and tactics. What Galbraith did was he said, when you look at a typical organization, and he was hoping that his did not fall into this category of a typical organization, there's much disharmony within the organization. When you look at the type of things that people complain about, what is wrong with the organization is no clear vision or linked operational goals. Many is not clear on exactly what their contribution is or how others should be contributing and how those contributions will be recognized. Is there an alignment between the measurements and the contribution that we want? Large gaps between responsibility and authority, policies and measurements, resource and prioritization conflicts, inertia, fear of challenging the status quo, and distrust between functions and levels. A person I quite admire, Tata Steel Bimlandra Jha, he coined the word of scars from the past, right? And you know when you walk into a meeting and there's two people that are always at each other's throat, right? How much disharmony it can cause. So what do we want? We want exactly the opposite. We want an organization that is clearly aligned to a common vision and goal. People know how they're going to be contributing. Any gaps between responsibility and authority has been removed. There are no critical conflicts within policies, measurements, and behaviors. And lastly, there's harmony between functions and levels. So what's a constraint that limits organizations to achieve these objectives? And normally the objectives include some part of growth, stability, and harmony. Well, at the time that Eli had developed the strategy and tactics, he hadn't yet come up with the insight that the main constraint in any system is not the market or capacity or supply or even cash, but it is management attention. And when you look at what is really then blocking us from exploiting better this management attention, is it that we have too little information? Is it that we have too little attention? And of course, we can investigate both of these two and said, well, the amount of information that people require to manage the organization, if you think about the what's, the how-tos, the why, is actually quite small compared to the available data that is out there. Whereas when you look at it from an attention perspective, this is the reason why Dr. Goldratt finally decided that attention is the system constraint, is that the things that can benefit from our attention or demand our attention will always exceed the available attention. That's where the shortage is. So if you go to the next step, then you analyze, but what is blocking us from better exploiting that attention, you become aware that there's kind of this inherent conflict. We talk about, as I mentioned in my previous presentation, we talk about paying attention because we recognize that there's a kind of a price involved. There's a cost, an opportunity cost lost when I give my attention to something or someone versus to somebody else or something else. But there's also a benefit, and the benefit that we gain is the focus that we get and the ability to do more with the same resources. And a common strategy that people have is that they multitask. They think more is better. And they keep on trying to do more and more things, hoping that the benefit of kind of spreading the attention will be outweighing the cost. But they don't realize the high cost. So Goldratt went back and he said, okay, so let's see. Of course, we have to, when we face a scarce resource, there are two ways that we can better exploit the scarce resource. The first way is we reduce the unnecessary demand on that scarce resource. Like, for example, reducing overproduction, right? So try and take away the many things that are wasting our attention and focus on a few things. But we also have to increase the supply. And increasing the supply looks at where are we losing this scarce resource. And there are 3 reasons why we lose potential. Is we do things that we shouldn't, we don't do the things that we should, and we end up repeating mistakes. So let's look at what can we do to prevent these mistakes. Dr. Goldratt said good. So he realized originally the communication was the main culprit for the problem that he was experiencing at that time. Later on, he realized that as a result of this poor communication, it was wasting the scarcest resource, which was management attention. It wasn't just that people ended up doing things that you shouldn't be doing and not doing the things that they should, but it was causing massive disharmony, which consumes management attention probably more than any other kind of task generator in a company, is when there's disharmony and you have to manage it. So he said, let's start with the most simple questions when you start with classification. What is strategy and what is tactic? And how do they relate to each other? This is the correlation part. And if any strategy and tactic is only as valid as its underlying assumptions, why are these assumptions never explicitly defined and validated in any conventional strategy and tactic formulation tools? And he said that he had read everything that he could put his hands on in strategy and tactic formulation. And the best that he could find was that sometimes it listed some risks or some assumptions about a certain strategy, but it was definitely not at the level that was trying to explain the specific assumptions related to every strategy or tactic. So looking at the definitions, he said, well, in the conventional view, strategy is the highest level of an initiative. It's kind of the overall direction. It's the stop part here. And of course, the executives are responsible for setting the strategy. And everything below it is the tactics. This is the details. So it was a kind of a what and a how to. And he said, but where does strategy end and where do tactics begin? And again, he read and couldn't find any clear indication about how you would differentiate these two. And then he asked the question, but is there really a one-to-many relationship between these? And probably the best way to kind of think about the problem is if you are looking at an organization that is trying to improve its return on investment, how can you improve return on investment? Of course, you can do it in two ways. The first one is you can increase net profit, and the second one is you can reduce the investment component. Do you agree so far? How do you increase sales? Your net profit is, on the one side, you can increase the sales component, and on the other side, you can reduce the cost component. And then each of these, you can reduce variable cost, and you can reduce fixed cost. So when you have a structure that looks like this, and when you go down a level, there's at least two ways of achieving the higher level objective. How many initiatives do you think you'll end up with by the time that you get to the people that have to actually do the work? Can you see that it's not unlikely that you come up with many, many initiatives? And yet, the top executive thought that they gave very clear focus that says, this is what we're going to do this year, right? So this was the problem that Goldratt had with this idea of, should it really be one to many? What he did was he said, what if we go back to the original definitions of strategy and tactic, and we simply define strategy as the answer to the question, what for? What are you really trying to achieve? And he looks at tactic and says, what if we just define tactic as the answer to the question, how to? What's the best way of achieving this objective? And as soon as he did that, he realized that strategy and tactic entities must always exist together. For every what for every objective, there must be a way of achieving it. Else you wouldn't have listed it. And for every how to, for every action or change, there must be a reason for doing it. There must be a strategy for it. So he immediately realized strategy and tactics exist as pairs. And they exist as pairs right through the organization. Now the question is, if there are more than one way of achieving a strategy, who should take the responsibility to decide which is the best way of doing it? Let me put it differently. Who do you think is in the best position to decide the best way of doing it? Well, there's two answers here. The one says the one that's doing it, and that's kind of part of the conventional approach that's called management by objective, that says, I'm going to give you the objectives for the year, and I'll leave it up to you to decide because you are the expert in supply chain or finance or risk management, decide what's the best way of doing it. So that's one way of communicating down and deciding who's in the best position. But of course, the person at the higher level is also aware of some specific things that make one way more attractive or less attractive than another that the persons at the lower level might not be aware of. And the recommendation here that Eli was giving to himself and to the people in his organization was that ultimately the responsible person for the tactic is the person at this level. He has to decide of all the ways that we can improve, for example, net profit. Are we going to focus on sales, increasing sales this year, or are we going to focus on reduction of cost? If we're going to do both, what would be the priority? What are we going to try first and then second? And he said, of course, that person can and should get the inputs from the level below, but ultimately it's his responsibility to decide, are we getting to the top of the mountain by climbing, driving, or flying? The second one is that they exist at every level. So if you think about a person working on the shop floor, they are busy with a specific process. There's, of course, an action and how to and a specific objective that they are trying to achieve that will tell them whether the process step that they are busy with is successful or not. So you realize that this exists at every single level and that each of these basically just represents a change that needs to be taken in order to achieve the top. So it's not a process map. It's not trying to identify all the things in the business. It's simply focusing on what are the changes that are needed to achieve the top objective. And you can kind of think about it, if you want to use a chain analogy, like it is not just the weakest link, but all the weak links, the ones that are not at the level of good enough, right? For example, it could be that the third level here is talking about our due date performance. The only reason why it's on the strategy and tactic tree is because our due date performance is not yet sufficient, not yet good enough to allow us at level 2 to develop a decisive competitive edge around reliability. And that's why it's on the map. So you can imagine that the strategy should be kind of verbalized in a way that says we want to go from the current level, which may be 70 or 80%, to a higher level, maybe 95 or 99%, because that's the level of good enough to achieve the overall objective. So you can kind of think of each of these boxes as one of the weak links that is not yet performing at the level of good enough. Of course, when you have it in a hierarchy like this, it shows you more and more details as you go down. When do you stop? When people know what to go and do. When you've been able to define it in a way that is called actionable information. But then how do we know that people know and agree what to do? I mentioned in my earlier talk, probably the worst way to check is to ask them, do you know and do you agree, right? So probably a better way would be to say, can you come forward and tell us in your area, what are you going to do differently on Monday morning? Right, this kind of helps you to see whether you've communicated an actionable information. You could also ask them, can you see any negatives or risks to what you have to go and change? Right? If we change the overall measurement from measuring efficiencies, for example, or resource utilization, and we change it to measuring only throughput, can you see any negatives or implementation obstacles? And if they say no, it's either that you've designed a perfect solution or that they don't really understand the solution. So it's a very useful structure to go down until you get to the point where it's actionable information and people know exactly what to go and do. The syntax that we use is from left to right. Remember, the objective of the strategy and tactic tree is to allow people to focus, not to waste their attention by doing things they shouldn't be doing, not doing the things that they should, or doing it in an unsynchronized way. So the idea here is that if you are required in this box here, let's call it 3.1.1, I don't want to see you working on any other boxes later on. One rule at a time, one change at a time. If you're not required here and you can already contribute in the setting up or the preparations or getting full kit downstream, absolutely you can do that. And I'll share with you some examples for different types of organizations on deciding on that. So in summary, when you are building a strategy and tactic tree, as you're going down, you're getting into more and more details by asking how. But for every one that you go down, we ask the question, what for and how to. When you're going from left to right, you essentially are looking at the when part. When is this required? And sometimes it's because it's a dependency. I can only do the second one once this one has been completed, or this one is by far the most important one to do. It will give me the biggest bang for my buck. And then to validate it going upwards is that when people read this, they should be able to explain why this is needed, going all the way up to how can this really help us to achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve. So a relatively simple way of checking. So in summary, each of the boxes on a strategy and tactic tree just represents a change that needs to be made. Okay, that clear in everybody's mind, right? So, of course, there's a number of ways that you could build a strategy and tactic tree. One useful exercise that you could try is you can get all the managers on little sticky notes, right? Say what change initiatives is currently happening in your organization. And then come forward to the board and position it where you think it belongs. And you just give them the kind of overall structure, right? One of the things that will quickly come out is that there are simply too many. And people don't always know how the change initiative that they're currently busy with are actually contributing to the top. A few years ago, I was working with a mining company, and I was asked to come in and help them. They were a little bit in a panic stage. They had to produce 12 million tons that year. They were in month 5, and they had only done 3 million tons. So not only they were not achieving the million ton a month, but they had fallen behind significantly. What made it more tricky was that this group said that they knew TOC and that they had already done everything that they thought good TOC people would do. And the third thing that made it quite tricky was they're miners, they're very big, and they don't really like consultants very much. So if you do things, they don't mind literally throwing you out the door. So I was wondering, how can I help them? So I thought, well, if they know the answer, let's see how good they are with knowing the answer. So I said, so can you write down all the things that you are currently busy with, that's currently taking up management capacity and investment? And I came up, when I got to about 100, I stopped them. And I said, okay, let's go back to the problem. The problem is that you have only produced 3 million tons. You're already 2 million tons behind. You need to get to 12 million tons. They said, yes, so what? I said, how many of these 100 initiatives will give you more tons? What do you think the answer was? Very few. Turns out that there's 2 that could help. How much attention were they getting? About 2% of the attention, right? So this is why the structure is also very useful, because it keeps on reminding you what is the overall objective that we're trying to achieve, and helping people check, is what I'm currently doing really helping to achieve more of those goal units? So the boxes each represent a change that we believe are necessary and sufficient. Each of these changes are not just given a title, but they are explicitly defined in what are we trying to achieve with this specific change, what's our strategy for the change, and how are we going to do it? Of all the possible ways to achieve this, what is the way that we decide, or the ways that we've decided to achieve this? But of course, any change is only as valid as its underlying assumptions. And this is the last question that Goldward had, is to say, well, if that's true, why don't we try to explicitly write down all the assumptions? And you'll see on this screen here, the what for part is the strategy, the how to part is the how, and the tactic, and then you've got 3 additional light gray boxes, the 3 whys. The top box is trying to explain why this specific change is needed. And I like to imagine myself, when I'm trying to write these, imagine myself standing in front of a group of people, and you have to sell them on a change. What's the first thing that you would feel pressure to do? Is to explain why this change is needed at all, right? And of course, here you can see the linkage between either sharing with them the big crocodile, the alligator, that's there, or sharing with them the pot of gold, right? Or both of them. It's kind of creating the gap between where we need to be and where we currently are. This would be a good answer for a necessary assumption, why the change is needed. When you then say to them, okay, I've now convinced you that a change is needed, and I've given you clarity about what it is we want to achieve by when, this is the strategy component, I will probably feel pressure to answer 2 more questions. Why do I claim that this objective, this strategy, especially if it's ambitious, is possible? Under what conditions is it possible? For example, if I'm saying that my objective is to grow net profit year on year, right? Not just the absolute number, but the percentage. Under what conditions is that possible? It's only possible if I'm growing my throughput faster than what I'm growing my operating expenses. Does that make sense? So the first part of a good parallel assumption is always, under what conditions is it possible to achieve this objective of the strategy, especially if it's ambitious? Imagine the objective being to be happy, right? How would you define the conditions that enables people to be happy? Turns out positive psychology has done a lot of work here, and they've now given a classification called PERMA, P-E-R-M-A. Basically, it's defining conditions for happiness. So that would be a really good parallel assumption to start off with, to say it turns out that people are sustainably more happy when P, they get more and more positive emotions. E, they feel engaged. They get into flow by what they're doing. It's a good combination between the challenge and the skill that they have. The more engaged you feel, the more you get into flow, the happier people are. R is for better relationships. M is for doing things that give you meaning. And A is for doing things that gives you a sense of accomplishment, right? Because remember what we're trying to do by sharing the assumptions, we want to make sure that the tactic doesn't come as a surprise. Does it make sense? If the tactic comes as a surprise, you know you've done not such a good job with the parallel assumptions. So the first parallel assumption is, under what conditions is it possible? The second one is, what will make it difficult or risky? That helped us to identify which of the possible ways of achieving the objective we've selected. So if I go back to the getting to the top of the mountain, if that was my strategy, and I've said to people that it's possible because it's been done before, or we've checked the physics and it's possible for a human being to get to the top of the mountain, sharing with them the things that make it difficult, I can remind them and say, oh, by the way, there's no roads to the top. And we don't have the money for flying, or it's not allowed in the competition. So of the 3 ways of getting to the top, guess what the conclusion will be for the tactic is, guys, we're climbing. Right? So from a consistency point of view, make sure that there's nothing in the strategy that didn't appear in the necessary assumption, and that there's nothing in your tactic that wasn't justified in the parallel assumptions. This is the second why. The third why is simply why this level of detail in the tactic is still not sufficient to ensure that people won't make mistakes in execution. Right? So for example, if I gave you an objective like have a process of ongoing improvement, and I ask people, can you write down the process of ongoing improvement? Right? We want to implement, this is our tactic, implement the process of ongoing improvement. What do you think the steps are that they will come up with? It could be many different steps depending on who's trying to do it. Versus if I gave them a reminder that says, and by the way, don't forget that the strength of the chain is governed by the weakest link. Do you think that will help them figure out what step should be always number 1 in trying to have ongoing, of course? That's really what the last why is, the sufficiency assumption. There's a kind of a warning that helps people not make mistakes when they go and execute. And those mistakes could be in forgetting one of the boxes, right? Insufficiency. It could be in necessity, adding a box that's actually not needed, or it could also be in a sequence of putting the boxes at the lower level together. And that's really what the sufficiency assumption is. So here's an example of how people could construct one. Imagine you're sitting with your team, and you ask them, what is our objective that we're trying to achieve? So it's an ever-flourishing company through profitable growth. Then you ask them, how are we going to do that? Of all the ways that we can achieve that, how are we going to do that? You'll notice that there's something in common with all the generic strategy and tactic trees that was done by Goldratt, is level 2 is always focusing on decisive competitive edges. And I'll share with you later on, but this is a simple way of thinking how to go one level below. So imagine this is the level that you are at. This could be level 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. The only reason why we have the box here is because it's not at the level of good enough, right? This is our actual is sitting here, and our target or requirement is sitting at some higher level. What we're trying to do when we go down one level is to figure out what makes up this gap. And if it's written like this, it basically says that if I have this decisive competitive edge and I have this one, these two together will be sufficient to give me the profitability that I'm looking for. Another way of looking at this is these are almost the mistakes that are being made for not being able to achieve this objective. And therefore, it's no surprise that below this will be DC1 and DCE2. Right? If this was happiness, I've just given you 5 possible ways where people theoretically lose happiness, right? It's called PERMA, P-E-R-M-A. Each of us could not have enough positive emotions or engagement or positive relationships. So again, you could create a second level by looking at each of these and deciding if there's some kind of natural order by which to do them. So that's how you go down from level to level. For example, if we jumped from level 2 down to level 3, we said, what are the things that are missing? Why do we not have a competitive advantage around reliability? What do we need to add to build such a competitive advantage? What do we need to do to fully capitalize on it? And lastly, what do we need to do to sustain it? So if you're building a strategy and tactic tree for a for-profit organization, this classification of build, capitalize on, sustain is quite useful as reminder boxes of what should be on level 3. And you repeat the same for level 4. And then you make sure from left to right the sequence that you've indicated here are correct. Alex Knight earlier mentioned about the importance of choking the release. I remember being in a session with Ellie, and he was asking TOC experts, you get on site, what's the first thing that you do? And all of them almost together said, identify the system constraint. And he went, no! Choke the release, right? Why? Because if you try to identify the system constraint with a lot of work in progress, it'll be a nightmare. So always step 1 is choke to release. So this is the idea of checking the when part, is making sure that the sequence from left to right is correct. And then the last part is making sure that your ultimate check is that it's clear why this is here. Is it really a necessary condition to achieve the higher level objective? So this could be like a little step 1, is just get the structure and the titles down for what you're trying to do, right? Whether to try and improve a company or to improve the happiness of an individual, whatever the objective is. Next step is then to take each of these and to try and to define it into more detail. And we do that by splitting them up into strategies and tactics. And for each of these, we try to verbalize as clearly as we can what the specific strategy or objective is of that change and what's the best way of doing it, the tactic. There's some guidelines. Some people like to use the titles in each box as a kind of a summary of the strategy or the objective. Some people like to use the tactic as a kind of a summary of the tactic as what goes into the box. Other people like to use questions, you can decide, right? It needs to be just that it's kind of like a navigation tool. People need to know where to go in if they're looking for information. So that's the next step then, and then the final step is then to take each of these and to make sure that the understanding is there. You try to answer the 3 whys for each of them, right? So why is this specific change needed? Why number 1, not meeting promises, especially when hefty penalties are involved, may bring a company to its knees. Why number 2, why is it possible but difficult or risky? Is that CCPM brings most multi-project environments to high due date performance without compromising content or budget. But be careful, most compromises on content or budget stem from the pressure to meet the promised due date. So if we can achieve the promised due date, then probably the pressure for the others in terms of making bad compromises will go away. And therefore the tactic is not just to implement the procedures, but also the culture of how can I help? And then the last why is this not sufficient? Is to ensure an outstanding start of a major initiative, it's vital that the first substantial actions will result in immediate substantial benefits. So it's a kind of a generic warning, but for people that know kind of what the 3 rules of CCPM is, and it says you have a choice of where to start, is there a natural one to start that will bring substantial immediate benefits that will help the change initiative to move forward. This is really as simple or as difficult to write strategy and tactic trees. You start with a clean slate, start off by thinking about all the things that you think need to change, need to improve on, try to put them into a logical hierarchy, but then take the time, take the responsibility to define each of them in more details. First, the specific objective or strategy of each of the changes, and then the how-to of each of the changes, and then lastly, the 3 whys. Let me show you a quick example. So this is one that we did for ABB. It was one that was initiated by the IT systems team, Frederick Nordstrom and his team. I don't know if Frederick is here in the audience, but he's definitely at the conference. I was working with him at the time, and they were embarking on a very large SAP implementation. And we decided to use this mechanism as a way to really be very clear about what we're trying to achieve and to keep the focus as simple as clear as possible. So for example, if you go to one of these top boxes, this explained to you the problem that they were facing at the time. Due to its exceptional organic growth and growth by acquisition, ABB had become a very large and complex organization, suffering from increasing conflicts between whether to allow business units to use or change the practices and IT systems that best meet their own needs, or whether to dictate practices and IT systems based on what's best for the group. And as you can see, one option for a necessary assumption is you can even put down the conflict that they were experiencing at that time. And to break this conflict, the board of ABB had put a stake in the ground, and they said, we want one simple ABB. And that is made up of 2 parts. The one is we have to agree on best practices for all the various functions. And the second thing is we have to agree on a standard system to implement these best practices. And that's where the initiative came from. So adding this in was very important to get all the team members on the project aligned. If you now go down and you look, for example, at level 3, which is from an operations perspective, their objective was to achieve and sustain reliable due date performance. In their case, what we found was they had over 300 different factories around the world. And we were looking at not what was different between these, but what was in common. And it turns out that there's 5 questions that if you don't have good answers or mechanisms for, will cause you to be unreliable, regardless of the type of widgets that you produce. For example, how do I quote reliable due dates? Because what most companies do is they quote a standard lead time of 4 weeks or 8 weeks, and I hope that they can continue to achieve that. Of course, if your scarce resources, capacity constrained resources, are already loaded to 6 weeks, can you keep on quoting 4 weeks and expect to have high due date performance? Can you? No. So what do you think should be highest priority when you go and do an implementation? Is to make sure that from tomorrow at least, any new order that comes in, we give a realistic expectation of when we can deliver. How do we do that? By checking what the load is on the scarcest resources. Doesn't take a long time to be able to do the simple calculations to do that. So when you open up one of these, it explains again the logic here of why offering quoted standard lead times cannot coexist with a high due date performance, especially when sales are going up. What's the objective that we're trying to achieve? Is that the delivery due dates the company is quoting are almost always met, irrespective of the growth. And how are we going to do that? And what we did was we used this as a mechanism to not just define the actual rule, but also to show how it will look. So for example, a new order will come in, it will go to the end of the load that's already on one of the capacity constrained resources, and that will give us when it will be started on that machine, and if we add half a buffer to that, it will give us the safe due date at the end. And then we ask the SAP consultants to go and design that into the IT system so we can see what it will look like. And also pick up if there was any problems in our communication with them about how the mechanism will work. Right, so this is one way of using a strategy and tactic tree, not only to map out what is required for the organization to grow, but also what changes in policies, process, measurements, and as a result, the IT systems have to carry. The other 4 of the questions, key questions, was one for procurement. Procurement's main job is to make sure that the factories are never starved, that they always have the right raw materials, the right purchase parts, but with the lowest possible stock. So again, the idea is go in there, why is this change needed? Because it's not at the level of good enough for many of those 300 factories. What's the mechanism that we propose? How will it work? And how will it look into SAP? The next one is planning. The big problem there is if you have factories that have multiple order fulfillment strategies, so all the way from engineer to order, all the way to make to stock. What is the mechanism to control the release of these orders into the system? 4th one, how to achieve single priority system throughout a chain. And then the last one is how to achieve ongoing improvement. How do I know where to focus if I want to increase my supply side? So if anybody wants this, we've got an approval. We've written an article about this, and we also have approval to share it. So if anybody wants to have a look at what's inside, you are interested, send me an email and we can share it with you. So kind of as a summary, a natural place to take a break is to say you'd start off by defining what it is that you want to achieve for the organization, for the system, for the individual. You build the structure, the logical structure between all the changes that you think are necessary and sufficient, and also the implementation sequence of those into a logical structure we call the strategy and tactic tree. Once you've done that, you can then apply, for example, critical project management to convert the structure into a pipeline of projects to ensure that people are not multitasking, that they're making one change at a time. And each of these are then converted into a specific buffered plan, and that we have mechanisms to measure if we are achieving that plan or not, and where the red areas are. And finally, use something like throughput accounting to quantify the impact of each of these changes on the overall objective of the company if it's a for-profit organization. So it's a kind of a natural place to take a quick break and ask, are there any questions up to now?
How is related building strategy from undesirable effects or these clouds and future reality tree and SNT tree? So how is this combined, or it's complementary?
was one of the assumptions that in order to build one of the strategy and tactic trees, one of the ways is you can do a traditional TOC analysis, right? Your UDIs at the various level become the justification for changes at that level, right? So one of the undesirable effects could be that our due date performance is below the expectation of our clients. If I look at that structure, that's probably a level 3 undesirable effect. Versus if the undesirable effect is that we don't have a mechanism to quote reliable due dates regardless of the load on the system, that would be a level 4. So you could use the traditional way. What's nice about this is you can then use it to structure it within levels and also in terms of sequence, in terms of the priorities. The warning here is simple doesn't mean easy, right? There's a project that I once did, and the CEO came rushing into our project office. And he said, "Young man, I need to speak to you." I said, "Yes, sir. How can I help?" He says, "This motto that you've given to the project, we need to change this motto." I said, "What's the problem with the motto?" The motto was, "Work smarter, not harder," right? He says, "There's always hard stuff required. Always. I don't want you to create the impression that there's not hard stuff required." So I said, "Well, how would you change it?" And he was thinking a little bit, and he said, "Think harder, work smarter, but some hard stuff is always required." So, yes, to do one of these, if you've tried to do them yourselves, it's hard, right? It takes effort because it exposes all your blind spots. When you're struggling to fill in why this change that you feel so passionate about is needed, it's good because it helps you check, is this a thing bloody really needed? Because it's going to take management attention. It's going to take money, So it's very quick to point out blind spots that we have and show us where the blind spot is. And that's, I think, one of the biggest benefits of explicitly forcing you to write the assumptions. Right? Sometimes we don't know. We just have a gut feel. We think this is the best way of doing it. We say, there's 3 ways of doing this. Let's go and try them. And as we figure out through experiments which ones work and why, we can go back and update the strategy and tactic tree. So it's not uncommon that you start without having all the stuff filled in because we don't know. We have to go and test it. And let me show you some examples. So transformational strategy and tactic trees is literally what it says, is how to transform a system from the current state into some desired future state. Right? Strategy and tactic trees are the only one that combines necessity, sufficiency, and sequence logic all into one logical diagram. Right? So those are the most common ones. All the Goldratt trees that are sitting in our library in Harmony are transformational ones. I'll show you one for Utah State Government, a lady by the name of Kristen Cox, who used to head up the workforce services there. She came to me at the last conference and said they wanted to learn a bit of the thinking processes, and we invited her over to come and attend the Odyssey. She went back, and a week after she had returned, she was appointed to head the new governor's office for planning and management, and that basically with a mandate to do whatever she did in her department that improved productivity so much, supervise it to be done to all the agencies. And she gave me a call and said, "What do we do now?" Right? She says intuitively she feels that she needs to sit down with a team, and now that they've got some good understanding of the thinking processes, maybe practice those thinking processes to help them build a strategy and tactic tree. Right? So this is basically what was done. So the one I'll show you is the outcome of that. The next one is organizational strategy and tactic trees. This is an interesting one because basically what it does is you've probably already recognized that a strategy and tactic tree maps the organizational structure. Right? So if you think about level 1, who is ultimately accountable for level 1? The CEO, right? Who would be ultimately accountable for level 2? Depending on what level 2 boxes are, it would be the direct reports of the CEO, typically the COO or the CFO, right? And as you go down, you can use it to define exactly what are you responsible for, but to try and verbalize it in this way. why is this job necessary for the organization? What's the specific measurable objectives that this job should achieve on an ongoing basis to make that contribution? What should they be focusing on? The tactic. And then why these things and not the many other things? These are the parallel assumptions. So we've done a few experiments. It's very early days. I've included an example. And again, if you want to see the details, because we're only briefly going over it, you're most welcome to send me an email and I'll send you the full copy. I've received approval that I can share it with you. We did one for Premier Foods, very large business in South Africa that makes bread and flour. They were one of the viable vision companies and realized that the organizational structure was no longer aligned with the vision that they had that was created with their transformational S&T, and use it as a way of changing the organizational structure and job responsibilities. And then the last one, and I'm sure that there will be more applications in the future, is what Ellie called the content S&T. One of the big car manufacturers came to Ellie and said their main problem is all the changes that happen between the original car design up to the time that they go to market. And this significantly delays getting the car to market. And he said, well, when do these change requests come through? And I said, all the time. And he said, well, what do you think about trying to communicate more clearly all the details of the design right at the beginning? As much as you know, do you think that could make a difference? And I said, we don't know, but we're willing to make an experiment. So think about the strategy and tactic tree, but in this case, the top level says, we have a new car design, this new supercar, but 4-door saloon, right, that will compete in these markets. Level 2 shows all the major components of a car and where changes will be needed in order to bring this, because not everything will change. Maybe the chassis stays the same, but the body shape will be different. Maybe the engines stay the same, but the drivetrains will be different, etc. Right? And all the way down to actionable information that will help everybody see exactly what this is all about. But then listing the assumptions and getting people to help you validate and test those. So that's what a content one is. We now use the strategy and tactic tree as a way of coming up with a very simple, focused design blueprint for SAP implementations. So let's look at the kind of questions that are relevant. I've already covered the transformational ones. Why is a change needed is your necessary assumption. What's the objective is the strategy. Why the change possible but difficult or risky is your parallel assumptions. The tactic is how will the change be implemented or what's the best way of achieving it. And lastly, why this level of detail is not sufficient. When you look at an organizational strategy and tactic tree, the necessary assumption question is, why is your job necessary to achieve the organizational goal or the goal of the one just higher than you? Why is your specific job necessary? The strategy, what must be your job function? What must you achieve on an ongoing basis in terms of effectiveness, efficiencies, compliance objectives, so that we know that you are making this contribution? What are the specific measurable objectives that you have to achieve on an ongoing basis? The parallel assumptions is why you claim that what occupies your time is necessary and sufficient to achieve your strategy, which is the tactics are basically headings for the things that you do, the things that take up your time and attention. And then the last one, interesting question in the sufficiency assumption is what type of responsibility versus authority gap fires consume your time? Because remember, this is a warning always. So if you write down, these are the type of fires that I have to deal with on an ongoing basis, and we know that fires come from gaps between responsibility and authority, right? Somebody brings to you a fire, they feel responsible for it, but they don't feel they have the authority to make any changes, so they bring it to you to decide. What we did with the process, what Goldred advised us to do, that we checked, and Henning de Prier and the team from Premier Foods and ourselves were working on this, was he said he would, as a first hypothesis, how do you create such a thing? He said he wants the CEO to sit down and try to create his one, right? And then to try and write the ones of his direct reports. And then he wants them to have a session with his direct reports where he shared with them his one, including this warning at the bottom. The warning that the CEO wrote for himself and his subordinates, to me, was quite beautiful. He said, as CEO, my job is to work on the business, not in the business. Whenever you are dragging me into the business, you're blocking me from doing my job. Right? That was the warning to his subordinates. So then he would present his, and he would ask them to do their own. And then there was a comparison between the one that he wrote and the one that was written by the person. And it was amazing to see the misalignments between what the CEO thought that these people should be doing, should be focused on, and why the people themselves were focusing on and thinking why they should be doing that. So it was a wonderful way to kind of break this misalignment, to close also the gaps between responsibility and authority, and to see obvious places where there was simply no one responsible for something, but also finding things where the same thing, one thing, multiple people were responsible for it. The last one is the content S&T, and this is basically trying to answer the question and the necessary assumption why a redesign of this subsystem is required to achieve the objective of the overall design at the top. So why a redesign is required, why a change is required. The strategy is what's the required performance requirements for this specific subsection or part that you are describing. The tactic here is how should the subsystem design be changed or modified? What's the best? Should we completely rebuild it? Should we just modify the one that we've got currently, like engines or drivetrains? And in the parallel assumptions is why we claim that the specifications of the new subsystem will ensure the required performance. Your best explanation of that. And what's a warning is why is this level of detail not sufficient? Why this change also require major redesign in the subsystems right below this, that this is not sufficient as an explanation. Are there any questions here before we go into examples?
Alan, do you understand correctly that each organization have to has at least two S&Ts, transformational and organizational, and how do they connect to each other? And do you understand correctly that organizational S&T cannot be properly done without transformational S&T? Because organizational, it reflects the strategy of the company.
Very good question. So the first answer is that the organization doesn't have to have either of the two, right? How do we know that? Because there are many, many successful organizations that have never heard about strategy and tactic trees. But at the same time, if you pick up that there are certain undesirable effects that tell you that there is misalignment, either in terms of the changes that are necessary and sufficient or the organizational structure to support those, that could create a need for that. Secondly, you're 100% right. Probably it makes a lot of sense to first have a transformational S&T, to decide what changes are necessary and sufficient and in what sequence, and only then try to figure out if this requires a change, if any, on the organizational structure. Very good. Thank you for the question. Yes, one more question.
Yes. My question is concerning when you build the S&T tree, let's say the transformational S&T tree in the first place, how you update it. So when the time is passing, can you tell a little bit about that?
Very good.
How you keep it fresh and so to say, what is the POOGI of S&T tree?
Very good. So there's a number of stages, and maybe it's a good idea to let's bump into the first one, right? So this is a strategy and tactic tree for transforming Utah state into the best managed state in the USA. A very ambitious objective, right? So the first step is you try and complete this to the best of your ability, right? You try to imagine yourself standing in front of the team, standing in front of the governor or the parliament, explaining why you think a change is required. What's the objective that we're trying to achieve? How are we going to do it? What's all the considerations that we've made? The second level is when you start presenting it to stakeholders, but not as a given, but from a point of view as that we need your contribution. How can you contribute is by helping us check logically these assumptions, and also maybe even to think about practical ways that we can test it through pilots, proof of concepts. So that's the second way of upgrading it, is when we present it, we are asking people to help us check it. Do you agree or disagree with the assumption that we have here? Do you think that we've missed something? Some key thing of why a change is absolutely necessary, right? So that's the second level. And then, of course, every level that you presented gives another opportunity for people to contribute. But the ultimate check is in execution. So when you go into execution, if you think about any of these boxes here, there are two things that we are monitoring in execution. We are monitoring whether we are achieving the strategy, the objective of that change, like the due date performance. Is the due date performance actually improving or not? The second thing is, are we implementing the tactics? Now, of course, if we are doing this in execution, the questions need to be a slightly different sequence, right? The first thing I want to know is, how are you implementing the tactic? The things that we agreed upon, are you doing them? Yes or no? And if they say yes, I go, really? What are you doing? Right? And when they explain to me what, I say, how are you doing it? Because I'm trying to pick up logical mistakes here, right? Once I'm comfortable that they are actually implementing the tactics as we've designed it, then I start saying, so are we getting the results that we expected? Are we achieving the strategies? And if they say yes, then how do you know you are achieving the strategies, right? So that's the ultimate check, is in execution. And the idea is not just to use it to expose gaps, but to then go back and say, if we are not achieving the strategy, it's either because we haven't implemented the tactics properly, which is most commonly the case, or the tactics that we've implemented were neither necessary or sufficient or done in the right sequence. Some bad compromises might have been made. So that's the ultimate check, is in execution. And the idea is, if you have good discipline, why don't you take those lessons and go back to the strategy and tactic tree and update them with what you found in reality? Does that answer the question? Okay.
So the question follows that when the time is passing, let's say that 1.5 years has passed,
yes,
and you can omit even some boxes because you are going from left to right.
Yes.
So when you have to think it over once again, the whole picture,
yes,
how do you do that?
You take where you are at the moment and say, okay, the original gap that we had, right, we were at $50 million. We wanted to get to $200 million. We are now getting towards 200 million. What should be the next target? And what should I now add? So I can keep on adding to the right of this. This is another way of keep on expanding it,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Or I can go back and say, this first thing that we did, the idea of how to give a reliable estimate, this now has to change because something in the environment has changed. I see which assumptions has been affected, and as a result, will the strategy or even tactic change? But the idea is that there's some kind of feedback mechanism that allows us to update the system. Russell Ackoff, Prof. Russell Ackoff, he was the father of systems thinking, and he said that one of his advices to companies is that we all make errors of commission and omission. Errors of commission is when we do things we shouldn't be doing. Errors of omission is when we don't do the things we should. And he said because of the fear of failure, that type of mistake is by far more common. And he said that the only way to try to reduce that type of mistake is to create a culture where people write down their decisions and the assumptions that was driving those decisions. Not only what to do, but when they decided not to do something, is to write those assumptions down so that they can go back and say, was it right or wrong, so that we don't repeat the mistakes. Yes?
Building on this question, when you move forward in the tree,
Yeah.
do you validate each step before you define it as finished and can move off the tree and you can move on?
Yeah, so we do a logical validation, right? But we also then do a validation by actual implementation. And that's where we are asking, did we implement the tactics, yes or no? If not, what was the problem and should we correct it or maybe go back and change the tactics because the assumptions was wrong? Are we achieving the strategy at that level? If so, yes or no. Did we make a mistake, a logical mistake? Do we need to go and update the tree? It does require discipline, but it's definitely worthwhile to do it. Yes, Matt.
These S&T trees apparently take some time to do, is that correct? And is there some guidance that you can give if the organization is actually already on fire?
Yeah, it's of course focus on the ones that are most urgent. And I'll show you just now a structure that we could use. For example, in all the generic strategy and tactic trees, what you'll see at level 2 are decisive competitive edges. That assumes that there's no fires, no other fires, apart from we are not achieving the growth. So for example, if you have a compliance issue, guess what should be 2.1? Should it be a reliability competitive edge? No, it should be fix the compliance problem, right? It's as simple as that. So if there are any of those risks identified, because remember, all this is trying to do is to help us focus, right? That's all that we're trying to do. It's trying to help every single level focus. So if there's something that they need to pay attention to first before they get it, should be there. It should be the first block at that level. Yes. Any more questions? Yes.
This is just a small one. While this is like you build competitive, decisive competitive edge, and this is the whole story more or less. Where is the constraint?
Where is the constraint? The assumption is, I like to think about it at 3 levels, but this is just my personal view of trying to make sense, because you could argue for a long time where the real constraint is. So let me try to explain how I like to think about it. The highest level is management attention, right? How do we ensure management attention remains focused as we get them to focus on the high leverage points? Where are the high leverage points? Unless there's compliance issues, it's decisive competitive edges. So it's almost assuming at a second level that the market is the constraint. So understanding that the market is a constraint helps us to focus top management by thinking about decisive competitive edges. But now I have a number of decisive competitive edges. How do I decide which of those to focus on? I now assume that my capacity is a constraint, and I'm thinking about which of these decisive competitive edges can I put in place without having to elevate capacity, by simply exploiting what I've got better, and that helps me to do that. So I tend to like to think about almost 3 levels of a constraint, each lower level helping the top one to focus on the right things. I hope it's not too confusing. Let's continue. So I included this one for Utah because it's not-for-profit. It's a state-run organization. As you can see, the top one is Utah is the best managed state. They also have some things that they think that they had to put in place to ensure this. Some things that they had to put in place to capitalize on what they've already done. Some things about sustaining. And then there's compliance side. They've included it at the back end because it's not yet an issue, but they want to make sure that it's something that is on an ongoing basis is monitored. So GOMBI, if you want to know the acronym, is the Governor's Office of Management and Budgeting. This is this group that is responsible for implementing TOC across all 24 agencies. So the first thing they said, for them to make a really good contribution, is they have to turn themselves into a project management office. The second thing is that they have to put some measurements in place. And the reason for the measurements, if you look at number 3.2.1, was very interesting. They realized that a lot of the agency management attention was being wasted by simply reporting measurements that somebody asked for many years ago, but nobody ever looks at. So I thought it would be wonderful from two perspectives. One, to free up management attention to say, you know what, from Monday morning, we don't need to see all of these things. Only these things matter. But obviously, secondly, it also is a fantastic way of starting a change initiative by offering immediate benefits to the people that you're trying to make some kind of change. So that's why this one was second. They decided on the motto to be better, faster, cheaper. And underneath each of these, there are initiatives that are driven both by Kevin Fox and his team, as well as internal resources from this unit, to take every agency through these 3 steps. The first one is better quality and coverage. So exposing bottleneck capacity, getting rid of backlogs, exposing capacity to offer better quality and better coverage. For them, it's not about throughput. It's about giving the highest possible quality and coverage that they can. The second one is how to do things faster, identifying critical processes within each agency and asking why can't we reduce the time by 80%. Ken Miller, who wrote We Don't Make Widgets, an extreme government makeover, I read his books. It's really interesting. We invited him over to Utah, and I was quite impressed with how much TOC was applying and also how ambitious his objectives was. So he was the one to get credit for saying, why can't we do these things at least 80% faster? And then the last objective is cheaper. And there's a couple of things that we look at. Of course, we expect that some of the avoidable costs, like overtime, having to pay for outsource laboratory service when you could have done it in-house, by doing it better and faster, many of those expenses will reduce. But other things that you could also look at is aggregation of buffers, right, of cost buffers. Every agency is asking for, say, $500 million operating budget for the year. So we said, what would happen if we gave them $400 million and we kept $100 million behind in a central buffer? And said, if you really need 100 or even more, you will get it immediately. But if we don't need it, there's no personal conflict to spend money that you don't need. Because we know that all the budget overruns accumulate and none of the under expenses, people feel pressure to spend it. So that's really what we did from that perspective. And they came up with what they call a success framework that helps them implement the various tactical tools for the agency to try and prevent multitasking, is to do them one step at a time. Get the agency to create a set of measurable goals and targets, create the necessary thinking processes so they can figure out how they will achieve those targets, create an operational and budgeting strategy that will deliver those, create the organizational support strategy, what they can do internally versus where they need external help, engaging staff at all levels, synchronizing policies and processes, and finally, how to stay focused on it, and the review and audit cycles. So this was the internal work that was done by Kristen Cox and her team to come up with this kind of success framework that they are using to move it around. And then building the capacity, going wide, prioritization, and going deep. So this strategy and tactic tree took us 2 days to build, over a weekend. And we had... Yes, 1 weekend. Yeah. We had lots of pizza and ice cream and Coke. That helps. Yeah. But it's, I think that what we're learning is that, you need to learn the right questions to ask. And once you know the right questions, you make it easier for people to contribute. When the questions aren't sure, then it's difficult. Then it can take a long time. When not all the right people are in the room, it will take a long time. And it doesn't have to be perfect. What needs to be pretty good is what's the first things that we're going to be doing, right? So we encourage them to pay more attention to those ones. You'll see that the E boxes means it's empty. We know it needs to be done, but there's no need for us now to go and fill in all the details there. We've just given them titles. They're probably 2 years away. Where we need to put in all the details is in these first boxes. There's a status here of NV that means not validated yet, which means it hasn't been presented yet to the governor or other stakeholders for their approval or contribution. Once we've done that, the status will be changed from not validated to validated. It means the green flag is given for implementation.
Were some people from the agencies involved in the process of developing this tree?
No, not initially. Good question. This was the tree for the Governor's Office of Management and Budgeting. And we're currently thinking about, is it necessary for the various agencies to have their own one? And what we've decided to do as a test is something like the following. So imagine you have Utah State at the top, and you have boxes right below that for the 24 agencies, right? And right below that, you have better, faster, cheaper underneath each of the agencies. And when a workshop is run with them, and there's opportunities identified, how to quickly get rid of backlogs, how to increase capacity to give wider coverage, we go through the process that I showed you with a change matrix cloud to say what's blocking us from making this change, breaking the conflict, and writing it into an S&T node. And that becomes their one. And if they have 2 or 3 of those, that is essentially it. It falls under that agency, under the objective of better, with maybe 2 or 3 nodes, and they agree on the priority based on which ones will make the biggest contribution. So that's the test that we're doing with them at the moment. So the next one, as I mentioned, is an organizational S&T, and I've given you the questions, so I'll read some text just to see kind of the type of thing that people are putting in. And the idea here is not perfection, right? I remember one of the things that really irritated me initially of the thinking processes where people came up with all these criteria of what is a good UDI, and if your verbalization wasn't perfect, it was wrong. Really? You know? So it needs to be good enough. What's good enough is that people understand what it means, right? And that they take ownership of it. So why is this job needed? This person said, the NewCo, this is for, they were creating this new company. The NewCo Way is a significant departure from the norm. The CEO is not only responsible for ensuring a smooth transition to this NewCo Way, but also to satisfy the shareholders' expectations in a responsible way. So the objective for the CEO is that the NewCo responsibly achieves the expected profitable growth rate. Responsibly means always meeting the legal requirements for safety, health, environment, labor, and competitive practices, right? Whatever else is relevant. What is the things that should take up the time of the CEO? The CEO ensures NewCo meet all legal compliance requirements. Number one responsibility. At least in South Africa, if you don't, you go to jail as a director of the company, right? There's no longer more fuffing around. You miss one of those things as a director of the company, especially as a CEO, you go to jail. Somebody dies, you can go to jail. You're criminally liable for that. So guess what? Pretty good number one. Number two, the CEO leads the development and communication of the strategy and tactic tree for all stakeholders. Number three, continuously validate assumptions and correct interpretation of the strategy and tactic tree by monitoring through rigorous and frequent audits whether strategies are being achieved and whether the tactics are being correctly implemented. If not, corrective actions are designed and tested. And lastly, to ensure sufficient resources are available to implement the strategy and tactics, there cannot be any internal constraints, and there must be sufficient protective capacity for enabling growth. Where this comes from is one of the parallel assumptions that says a company can only grow to the available protective capacity. Quite a big insight when we were writing this at the time, right? You can only grow as much as what you've got protective capacity for at that point in time. And it's his job to make sure that there's enough protective capacity at any point in time to achieve the growth targets that have been agreed with the board. And of course, there's some additional ones here as warnings. Even the most experienced CEO needs help to identify and minimize errors of commission and compliance, doing what should not be done, and even more importantly, to identify and minimize errors of omission, not doing what should be done. And as a result, there is a specific requirement for this person to have somebody sitting that is covering his blind spots. And there was a specific agreement on who that person is. Should it be an internal person or an external person? Let's look at a content S&T. I've given one example. This is throughput accounting as an example of a content. Content S&Ts don't necessarily have sequence from left to right. It's just all the components that are needed for something. Like, for example, what are the mistakes that can be made in judging the performance of the company, in judging business unit performance, in judging make-buy decisions, in judging product or service viability or profitability, in judging new investments, and in setting product and service project pricing. So again, you want a copy of this, you're most welcome. Just send me an email. To conclude, I just want to, there's these engines of disharmony that Goldert had identified, and he said that he thinks strategy and tactic trees are a very good solution to remove these engines of disharmony, because it allows people to see clearly what their contribution is at any level, what others should be contributing. It should be designed in a way to remove conflicts in rules, to close gaps between responsibility and authority, and to prevent inertia from taking place. So, of course, there's lots of concerns about S&Ts. Too complicated, takes too long, only few people can do it. We spend a lot of time on it and then don't look at it again like a good project plan. So what I presented before are some ways that we've been developing, and there's a lot of people around the world that are continuously finding new, simpler ways of doing it. I'm in a privileged position having access with Harmony. I'm getting emails all the time from people saying, you know, we tried it out. We were a little bit anxious, but, you know, in only 1 or 2 days, we got very good agreement. It was a fantastic tool to focus everybody on what should be done and what should not be done, especially if there are many initiatives. Because when you get people to write down all the initiatives and they see the tree is this big and you ask them, do you have enough management attention to do that? And I go, no. You say, okay, click the delete button. Tell us what you're going to delete or move out. It's quite an empowering thing. I've presented many of these. As I mentioned, the one that I drew here, you've got current profitability. You can think of the next level as doing things to prevent those mistakes, like protecting current profitability or viability is ensuring compliance. Reducing lost sales to existing customers could be your first decisive competitive edge that will achieve that. Reducing avoidable cost could be the next one. Having another competitive edge that reduces lost sales to new customers, market share that you don't have, or new markets that you don't have, could be the next one. And then finally, you could have something about exceeding minimum compliance levels, social responsibility issues. So that's a practical way of thinking through what should be on the next level, or what are these conditions that make up the gap or the mistakes that we make. For another one is, if we think about level 3 going to level 4, we want to improve and synchronize flow. What's the common mistakes that are made in planning is we release things too early or too much or too little too late, and we don't buffer properly. We buffer individual parts rather than the overall. So guess what? Next level should contain blocks for those two mechanisms that we need. The next mistakes that we make is in execution, where we don't have synchronized priorities, or there's lots of expediting or not enough expediting and escalation. So again, those are the two mechanisms needed to prevent those two mistakes. And then lastly, from the continuous improvement side, there's still some remaining local optimization and insufficient protective capacity. And that gives me an indication of what that is. So I found that when you facilitate, people kind of get the idea of what makes up this gap, what's the mistakes, what are the conditions, and that becomes your next level, and then you can check sufficiency, sequence, and necessity. I presented quite in a lot of detail on day 1 this process of how to go from a problem, validating the importance of the problem, writing it as a change matrix, resolving it with one of the 4 methods, doing all the yes but checks, writing it into an S&T node, and if you want, you can then add it back into a strategy and tactic tree. So that's another way of building a strategy and tactic tree. So think about the top person standing up and saying, guys, this is the objective for the year. Tell us what's going to make it difficult for your department to achieve this objective. They write down their problems or UDIs. They explain why it's bad for them in their system. They write their change conflict. They find a way of breaking it. They look at all the yes buts and they write it into an S&T node, and now you have their node. And they've taken full ownership. It wasn't something that was written by an external person. It was written by them for their environment. You could also look at strategy maps. Strategy maps by balanced scorecard was a solution to a problem that Kaplan and Norton were identifying, companies that had implemented balanced scorecard but weren't getting the benefits. And they found out that the reason for it is those companies that were getting the benefits were companies that had directly aligned the balanced scorecard measurements with a strategy for the organization. The ones that weren't getting benefits were the ones that went to every department and said, you need 4 types of measurements to cover these 4 aspects. And it was completely all over the map, unsynchronized, unsupported. So a very good example, they basically look at the 4 perspectives of financial. So how will the shareholders benefit? The customer, what do we need to do for the customer to achieve those financial targets? What internal process changes do we need to make to satisfy the needs of the customer or to improve productivity? And finally, the learning and growth. What are the changes in systems, cultures, measurements that we need? And then for each of these boxes, they then define the details of what's the objective of that box, what's the specific measurement, the target, and the initiative. So the objective and initiative is kind of like our strategy and tactic, right? What they don't do is they don't put any of the assumptions down. So you can take an existing one. It's beautifully simple. This is one for Southwest Airlines. Beautifully simple way of communicating the overall strategy for the business. And if you are worried that there are some concerns about the details, not enough details, you can then convert it into a strategy and tactic tree. First of all, by breaking up each of these boxes into the strategy and tactic, the objective and initiative, and then to take the trouble to also list the assumptions that are underlying it. To wrap up, I think S&Ts can really help us better exploit our limited attention by defining and getting agreement about what to focus on, and as important, what not to focus on, what not to change. The structure, I think, is designed in a way to really organize knowledge and to communicate not just the what and the how of the knowledge, but the key assumptions of necessity, sufficiency, and sequence. There are different types of S&Ts, and I'm sure we will be discovering more. It's conceptually quite simple. I hope that that's what you take away from this, that you're not scared of it anymore, or that you think it's for somebody else. It's actually conceptually quite simple. It's a set of questions that help you pick up where you've got blind spots in your logic or in your communication of that logic. And I encourage you to go and try. Yes, simple doesn't mean easy. It does take a bit of hard work. But believe me, with the right people in a room together, there's no reason why you can't do a good enough job in 1 or 2 days and get started. And lastly, we are continuously developing better, faster, simpler ways to do it. Please share that. I encourage you to share it. We are all standing on the shoulders of giants. Thank you very much for the time.